This game is special to me. I'll never forget it. Time for this channel to do something weird. Time to delve into the good-bad territory, the dark souls of survival comedy horror. Of course, it has to be a Japanese game. Oh, those cats know how to get weird. But how weird exactly? Well, how about we ask a game that holds a Guinness World Record for the most critically polarizing survival horror game, Deadly Premonition. Deadly Premonition is... how should I say this? Imagine if Twin Peaks was directed by a Japanese Uwe Boll. Now, I apologize, that came out too rough. Let me try again. Imagine if you got Resident Evil 4, Silent Hill and Twin Peaks, but then something went horribly wrong. That's Deadly Premonition. When it first came out, the reviews were heavily split on it. Some called it one of the worst games of the current generation, citing tanky combat, overly convoluted story, obsolete graphics, weird and unnatural facial expressions, and so on. But then, there were others. They considered DP, sorry, not gonna call it that anymore, one of the best games ever made, and the clunkiness, the weirdness were part of its irresistible charm. Destructoid gave it 10 out of 10, while IGN gave it a mere 2 out of 10. Gamma Sutra gave it best cult game, while Games Radar gave it best worst game. You get my point. Deadly Premonition originated from another game called Rainy Woods. The initial prototype was made in October 2005 by a studio called Access Games, founded by just 6 people, and an alpha iteration was created in March 2006. It was supposed to be a multi-platform game for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. However, Rainy Woods was soon cancelled due to considerable technological difficulties with two platforms' hardware, including memory allocation and lighting. In 2008, Access Games started working on Deadly Premonition, which had a new lead character and new story. According to the interview, in the very beginning the developers were thinking of having some kind of scientific crime mystery solving story, sort of like X-Files meets Whodunit. But then, after several meetings within the team and the producer, they decided to give it more of an occult angle. The project almost got cancelled 4 times and the budget for the game was fairly small. Since then, the game has amassed a cult following and is considered either one of the greatest games you'll ever play or one of the biggest dumpster fires you'll ever warm your hands with. How exactly did that happen? What causes such polarization of opinions amongst game critics and ordinary gamers? Some call it a second coming of Christ for such things as character development, story and soundtrack, but others claim it's too janky and borderline experimental. How can it be groundbreaking while having one of the most atrocious Resident Evil 4 clone type of combat? People say it's infinitely times greater than the sum of its parts, but at the same time they claim it's one of the most bugged games ever. Too broken to play, or the weirdest masterpiece you can find? Let's find out. I have to make a confession right at the start. I have never seen Twin Peaks. Through osmosis, I know that there is an eccentric coffee-loving detective, a strange murder mystery, and a supernatural angle of the entire affair. But no more than that. I consider it my strength while reviewing this video game. Nobody wants an in-depth analysis that's analyzing every frame and comparing it to the source material. I think it's boring as fuck. I mean, sure, you can point out that the main protagonists share multiple quirks like appreciation of well-made coffee, their monologuing habit, and trust in strange signs. You can also point out that the main murder that kickstarts the whole game is similar to Laura Palmer's for multiple reasons we won't go into because of spoilers. But I'd like to review this game as a standalone experience, so for me, who's never seen Twin Peaks, I consider that a strength for this endeavor. But what if I told you that initially there were even more similarities between the two? Initially, as I said earlier, the game was called Rainy Woods, and it was shown at Tokyo Game Show 2007. This was when many people criticized the game for obvious references and similarities to Twin Peaks. That made the lead developer to scale back on references, and that's how we got Deadly Premonition with a new protagonist. Imagine, this game is a watered-down version of what was initially planned by the developers. So it could have been a complete double. A digital twin, if you will. Speaking of vibes, Deadly Premonition is unique in the sense that it's psychological horror coupled with the weird Japanese-styled sense of humor. It's not afraid to be weird in the story, and the whole game has this dreamy, almost ethereal-like feel to it. There are themes of real and surreal, conscious and subconscious, good and evil, earthly life and eternal life, singular and dual personalities. But what is Deadly Premonition? Well, to put it simply, it's a psychological horror video game that gives you freedom to explore the small town of Greenvale and choose events and activities to participate in. Yes, just like in Yakuza games. Also hails from Japan if you didn't know, so all lessons are thoroughly learned. In the game you control an FBI agent, Francis York Morgan, but call him York, that's what everyone calls him. Anyway, your job is to arrive to rural town of Greenvale and investigate the identity of the Raincoat Killer, who's responsible for the murder of Anna Graham and is told to take lives only when it's raining. That's the premise, anyway. As the game indicates, you took on this case because of the killer's MO, a ritualistic murder of a beautiful woman where red seeds are found on or near the body, which is strikingly similar to a series of other murder cases across the US. So it's a serial killer with a signature style. Bad news, right? Inside the game though, we have an open world, non-linear gameplay, free-roaming storyline where every character has their own routine. When I first played it, it almost felt like GTA meets Silent Hill. And just like in every GTA game, the main task is getting rich. At the start you're strapped for cash, but there are various ways to obtain it. Finishing levels or quests, completing routine tasks like shaving your beard, and we all know that takes actual effort, changing suits, etc. Conversely, you can get fined for poor performance, like being Stinky Bum who's wearing a 3-day-old suit. If only we had such hygiene police in real life. If only. Additionally, our brave agent requires sustenance and regular sleep to function properly. If your hunger meter reaches 0, you'll start losing HP, so be mindful of that. You didn't come here by bus, you have your own trusty vehicle. You may explore Greenvale on foot or by car. Traveling on foot is cheaper, as cars must be maintained, as they consume fuel, which you must purchase every once in a while, and your car has its own HP. If it drops to 0, you won't be able to drive it anymore, so you need to keep it fixed at all times. There are ways to obtain different cars, but it's better if I keep shtum on that, to make your journey more authentic. Get this, places of business have specific hours of operations, and you must visit them at those specific hours to make use of their services. Yes, this game has a day-night cycle, which you can speed up by smoking cigarettes, which is something I didn't know in my first playthrough. I had to actually wait until the next day began and people went on with their routines until I could talk to them. If you missed the necessary time slot during your investigation or pursuit for all the side quests, there is absolutely no penalty for you to try again the next day. This thing is dynamic, I tell you, because if you interact with people at the right place and the right time of day, they might offer you a side quest, which is always nice. The game has dozens of side quests that produce small respite from the investigation and profiling process. But there's a caveat to all this. You see, when you complete side quests, your reward isn't necessarily an item in the game. The reward is often just more dialogue and more story and more depth to the characters. It seemed that the game was rewarding the kind of player who is interested in learning more about the world, and that was intentional. The game director stated that unlike other games where your reward for a quest can be a new level, item, skill or some such, in Deadly Premonition he wanted to make rewards come inwards, not outwards, if you catch my emphasis. And so, with more knowledge of what's going on in the town or more knowledge of the people that you're going to interact with in the game, you become fond of the people in this small town. So the reward is not just about hearing more dialogue, it's also intended so that the player would feel more comfortable within the town. And you know what? It worked. After spending 20-something hours in the game, I can safely tell you that I know a lot about people of Greenvale. And it helped me to profile them and include investigation in the proper manner. I know their quirks, their routine, their occupation, their likes and dislikes, and all that is thanks to those side quests. You know, after playing this game, I'd like to say that I wish more games would bother more with unraveling side characters of the story. It makes it infinitely times more interesting. Bear in mind, you can plow through the main story without hanging out with the characters, and you can still get a very satisfactory story. That's the trait of a game, a great game, that allows you to play it at your own pace. And what's a Japanese game without a few minigames, am I right? Gameplay of Deadly Premonition reminds me of Shenmue, which is another cult classic game while we're at it. This game doesn't have forklift side hustle, but it can offer us fishing, racing, and darts. Another side activity worth doing is trading cards hunt, which are scattered all throughout the town of Greenvale, and finding them all can be painful but extremely rewarding. If I'm being honest, when I played Yakuza, I paid a lot more attention to minigames other than the main plot, because for reasons unknown to me, I considered minigames something realistic, something that I can see myself doing in real life, you know? I couldn't beat up 5 punks all in one go, but bowling? I can be down for that. And so, realism is something that can be interesting, engaging, demanding at times, and exciting if done right. But it also can be ruthless, unnecessarily gritty, boring, and non-user-friendly. Believe me when I say this, Deadly Premonition falls, if somewhat clumsily, into the former category. As the game director himself says it, a realistic setting was completely necessary for bringing the story to life. To build it, he posited 3 reals: real time, real scale, and real life. Let's look at them more closely. Firstly, as for real time, meaning to correctly depict a 24-hour span, developers really went out of their way and calculated weather patterns and the angle of the sun by giving their fictional town a real-world latitude. That's Japanese precision for you. Next, for real scale, the developers went even crazier. They actually traveled to the US to note the measurements of the various billboards, railroad crossings, and roads to create the sense of realism. Every house, every street was named and given their respective number. That is insane. Can you imagine a group of video game developers that travels to another country to conduct an extensive research to make sure their fucking billboards are true to purpose? Well, now you can. The developers specifically studied the American Northwest. They've been to places in Washington, Oregon, and some places in California for their study. And lastly, deep in the abyss of madness, we have real life. And for this, I will need to quote the game director, Hidetaka Sueri Suehiro. Quote, "We wrote extremely detailed profiles for the town people, blood types, birthdays, favorite foods, favorite music, people they disliked, what age they were when they had their first kiss, etc. And while not necessary for the game proper, these were used to create individual 24-hour activity patterns for each character. For example, when the punctual character Thomas rises in the morning, he goes to the toilet, washes his face, brushes his teeth. If you have a moment while playing, try spying on his apartment and you'll actually see Thomas performing these actions. And despite not appearing anywhere in the game, we even set the hourly wage for the diner, about $3.50 per hour, and $25–30 per day, depending on tips. And of course, every street in Greenvale has its own name. For a project as rush as this, replicating an entire rural American town from inside Japan, details like this were extremely important. The original concept of the game is living in and feeling part of the town. Even if the player is an efficient FBI agent, he will also become hungry, sleepy, and stinky if he doesn't bathe at all. This doesn't change even if zombies appear in the town, or even if serial murders occur. It also means we are not perfect, just human. I wanted to bring reality into the game using those factors." End quote. Oh shit, I forgot about the zombies. Yes, guys, this game inexplicably has zombies. Check this out. Throughout the game you will encounter shadows. They are, according to fan speculation, dead people from the town of Greenvale. But that's not the main point. The main point is that these are non-skippable levels you have to clear, and in order to do that, you need to send these shadows into the past tense. They usually appear in the purple smoke, so when you see it, you know things are about to get gun o'clock. But here's the weird thing. Story-wise, nobody knows anything about these shadows. And what's more is that the only person who sees them is you. Is that a reference to our protagonist's mental state? Or is it the fact that you're an outsider to this place and you see what can't be seen by others? But no, the answer to this is much more tragic. So you may ask the inevitable question, Vlade, why add levels and enemies that are not explained, seen, or heard by anyone other than you? They don't have any bearing on the story, right? These levels almost seem out of place for this game. How come they got into the final cut of the game? Well, what if I told you that the combat sections of Deadly Premonition were added in the last minute of the developmental process? In all of their infinite wisdom, the publisher company decided that the game will not sell well in the West if it's not going to have combat sequences. I mean, there you go. Conversely, certain sections of the game were toned down in terms of violence and gore to placate the nuanced Western gamer. GG, well played. But what can be said about the combat, if anything? It's bare bones, tanky, really simple, and clumsy at times. Almost all of the times. If the gameplay of Deadly Premonition can be compared with Clock Tower or Shenmue series, the combat is especially reminiscent of Resident Evil 4. To put simply, it really is the worst part of the game. I played it first on Xbox 360 and the tank controls and overly difficult combat, which was toned down in the director's cut version, were simply too much for me at the time. Now I'm replaying the game on PC version and, along with the crashes to desktop, stuttering FPS and general jankiness, oh by the way there's a fix for everything except for the last thing, that's part and parcel of Deadly Premonition. I'm happy to report that combat sequences are a breeze because now we have infinite ammo right at the start. The difficulty they set for the PC version is in between easy and normal, so even a child can complete these stages. They could have removed the combat from the game altogether and no one would even notice. As I mentioned before, Suehiro created a new protagonist, Francis York Morgan, with the help from his friends from the US. He and his good friend, a movie director in the independent Japanese scene, Kenji Goda, created something beautiful together, the personality disorder of our main character. You see, Detective Francis York Morgan constantly talks to his imaginary friend Zack. This isn't a spoiler, he starts blabbering to him the very first minutes of the game, so you pick up on this extremely quickly. The character of Zack, if he can be called that, was created to involve the player emotionally in the game by providing the sense that York is addressing and talking to the player. But the genesis for that idea lies in his conversations with his independent film director friend. Together with Kenji Goda, who can be considered a script collaborator at this point, they wrote the main plotline and another very important quirk of Francis York Morgan: his endless, ceaseless, uninterrupted stream of movie trivia. In his interview to a website Game Developer, Swery says that when he and Kenji meet, they talk about movies for hours, sometimes while drinking, and he thought to incorporate this vast knowledge of movies into the main character. It was a surprise hit among fans, thanking Swery at every opportunity for the fact that Francis York Morgan can speak for hours about Clockwork Orange, Tremors, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and other cult classics. Talking about what went right, we can't help but touch upon the topic of character building and their backstory. Especially the main character, Francis York Morgan, and his imaginary friend Zack. Here's another quote from an interview with game directors Swery and Hitoshi Okamoto, art director of the project. Quote, "We believe our greatest success in Deadly Premonition was the establishment of our main character. Many different types of protagonists have been created and loved in the history of video games, so our primary mission was to devise the type of hero that had never existed before. Deadly Premonition is essentially a mystery, and although quality peripheral characters are crucial in good mysteries, the main character is especially important. I believe players pick up on the fact that while York may appear very handsome, he is a true eccentric inside. York speaks his mind with no regard for the feelings of those around him, while constantly muttering to himself. In other circumstances, it would be no surprise if players grew to dislike him, wondering, who the hell is Zack? Yet everyone who plays the game seems to love him. Why? Perhaps it's because players recognize that he is extremely charming and reliable, a friend worthy of admiration. Of course, we don't think that we gained that recognition for free. There's an important device at work, the invention of the Zack as player relationship. Agent York pursues his murder investigation in Greenvale, the player munches popcorn in his living room, and Zack is the bridge between them. You might say that the character we were aiming for is established the moment York and the player become true friends, joined through the conduit of Zack. Agent York is a character who only springs into existence with the assistance of the person playing the game. and that turned out to be exactly the new type of hero we were after." End quote. Now, I did read several professional reviews about the game that claimed that the voiceover was so bad it's good, that it can be compared to the House of the Dead or Earth Defense Force series. But others claimed that the voice acting was superb, that it added another layer of mystery and the characterization to people on Greenvale. So, it seems that the game has even more polarizing features than I initially thought. How delightful. I'll try to explain what happened here. Voice acting was well done. Actors didn't slack off or phone it in. However, the delivery was really off and it sounded like we were in a sitcom with a shoestring production budget. It's a mixed bag, like everything in this game. However, I should note that the key characters like George and Emily did a fantastic job voicing their characters. However, I get the impression that others were given less material to work with. Hidetaka Suihiro spoke English as he was supervising the voiceover process, sharing his thoughts on the matter with the rest of the people. But I get that him being a Japanese, he could miss out on important details of people recording the lines the way they did. The devs themselves consider voice acting to be better than the soundtrack. Who's the crazy person here, you might ask? But consider this, they only had 2 weeks worth of time to record over 6,000 total lines of dialogue, including preloaded and streaming samples. That means they had to do approximately 500 lines in the can every day. The pressure was incredible. According to Keiji Teranishi, the game planner, they spent those 2 weeks completely sequestered in the studio. And rightfully so, they only had so much time in America before coming back to their office in Japan. But, among all the voices, one actor out-fucking skilled everyone in the studio. That was none other than Jeff Kramer, the voice artist for Agent Francis York Morgan. According to Mr. Teranishi, Jeff brought even greater depth and style to the lead role that Access Games had envisioned. Despite only having 5 days to record some 3,000 lines, since he was a lead and he talked a lot, Mr. Kramer presented everyone with a truly brilliant performance. It's a delight to listen to his lines. And some of the most interesting monologues work extremely well because Jeff plays it so straight. Fun fact, the voice actor for York has done nothing but Deadly Premonition games in the last 10 years. But then again, when you reach the perfection, what else can you do, right? It grows on you, and that can be said about the characters themselves. They all have distinctive features that are especially prominent when they speak to you. Even though the acting can be considered bad at times, we have to bear in mind that it was recorded at the behest of an eccentric Japanese person who was in over his head with this project. And that makes voice acting for me a lot more amusing. It's like watching The Room with occasional brilliant performance of Jeff Kramer, who outshines everyone the minute he walks into the scene. And such wobbly voice acting helps us establish the fact that the town of Greenvale is almost dreamlike, with people who have exceptional eccentricity to them, which makes them even more special to me. If we're talking about distinctive features of the game, then we should definitely talk about the music. The soundtrack bolstered unique story in the world. It evoked mood that was never seen or felt before in video games. The score is really unusual, with improvised songs that create the atmosphere of madness to a light-hearted whistling tune that can be heard every time the mood of the game is carefree. Composers really understood the game. They were giving design documents and they played music they thought would fit, so some tunes were greenlit almost immediately. There were, of course, other tracks that were created through much trial and error. 2 particular tracks were difficult to conjure, Red Tree and Miss Stiletto Heels. Game developers were crazy specific about their demands for these themes, not only for arrangement, sound levels and effects, but also about such things as timing of hi-hats within single bars. I myself would give the soundtrack an A+. Whistling tune of Life is Beautiful is such an earworm that when I listen to it, I'm helplessly beginning to tap my foot without even realizing it. That's how catchy it is. It creates a feeling of a peaceful and carefree country stroll, making you forget about all the unpleasantness with the murder mystery and such. I believe the soundtrack of Deadly Premonition can easily be added to the Hall of Fame, with such greatest hits as Disco Elysium, Nier, Persona, Undertale, and Silent Hill 2. Soundtrack is one of the game's features that works extremely well. It's not wobbly, whimsy, or broken, it adds depth to the unique world and characters. One feature of a great soundtrack is that you want more of it. and I can definitely say that I'd love nothing more than to hear more score tracks from its composers. But it wasn't all peaches and cream. Quite the contrary, the game is a flawed masterpiece through and through, and it is oh so hard to overlook the bad parts. But to quote Francis York Morgan, hardships are part and parcel of life. They're what lets us appreciate the good times. Isn't that right, Zach? Which is why we're going to get technical about it and talk about such exciting things as memory allocation and physics engine. If you want, go ahead and skip to this time code to avoid all the techno babble. For those unfortunate who's going to stay with me, buckle up. Let's put on the medical gloves and dig deep into the steaming pile of code. And let's start with processing speed, the first of the four horsemen of Deadly Premonition. For Access Games, Deadly Premonition was the first foray into the next-gen development, so they got an astounding amount of available RAM, much more than what was available before. That feeling begets overconfidence, and you need to remind yourself that overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer. This brought about the worst-case scenario. Their data management became sloppy, as lead programmer claimed. For example, they said too many objects in the outdoor scene, which caused them not to be processed effectively. Trees and bushes were extremely problematic. Conversely, cutting too many outdoor objects would render the scene to be unacceptably barren and painful to look at, so the devs had to constantly balance between objects and code optimization. Processor bottlenecking also became a thing. There were multiple issues all over the place. Lighting, shadows, water ripple effect, refraction effects, mirror reflections, everything was a fire that they had to put out. And so, memory allocation was a huge failure across the board. But it wasn't the only failure. Like I mentioned, shadows and lighting were exceptionally trying. The developers experimented with various types of lighting. Real-time processes like flat lighting, point lights, spotlights, whatever. That also brought processing bottlenecks. Their desire to find the optimal aesthetic for the game shadows was a huge pain for the processing rate. Due to the fact that vast outdoors contained too many objects and there were no surface obstructions, the shadows had to appear sharp. But here's the thing, generating such sharp shadows requires a huge amount of VRAM, which caused the game performance to dip dramatically. Ultimately, programmers and designers had to compromise on the sharp shadows they wanted, so as to avoid speed drops. Right now in 2024, such aspects of game development are commonplace, but back then in 2008, the guys didn't have the technical know-how to avoid such pitfalls. I feel very sorry for them because they obviously had good intentions, but their uphill battle with next-gen development was just unwinnable. I did mention physics engine, let's talk about that. Yutaka Okawa, programming support in the project, says, quote, "At the beginning of development, I was convinced that implementing a physics engine, NVIDIA's physics, would allow us to build an exciting, never-before-seen world. It was indeed a great boon to the project, driving the behavior of vehicles, the interaction of objects, and even the fluttering of hair. Physics did allow us to glimpse into a new world. However, the use of physics engine was not all positive. After incorporating too many realistic physics behaviors into the world of our game, we often found ourselves at their mercy. Game worlds require not infrequent cheating, but physics behavior is brutally honest. In situations where we had to implement convenient cheats, bending the behavior of a character's prop in a demo scene, or forcing vehicles to navigate properly, physics behavior would conflict with that. The processing load for physics operations also proved to be much higher than expected, which was another large miscalculation on our part. Because we originally had everything that could possibly be displayed with physics engine running through physics, like hair, clothing, even fishing rods, we failed to produce an enjoyable gameplay environment. In our zeal to pursue individually moving objects, I might say we lost sight of the overall processing picture. And to maintain frame rate, it became necessary to optimize. We reduced physics actors and adjusted computational loads for each scene individually. However, this made an adversary out of the game's key feature, freedom, as we had to consider an enormous number of variables when making such adjustments. This process was not quick, and when combined with the aforementioned physics behavior tweaks, it consumed even more of our time and energy." End quote. And here's the last horseman of the apocalypse. Get this. Access Games had no sound department. Let that sink in. The game virtually had no in-house sound effects. They had to resort to online sound effects libraries to remedy the situation, but the result is You can only go so far with sound libraries. In the credits they list one sound designer, and it was likely that he was just ripping the sounds from various sources to fill in the sound pinata. They could potentially outsource the sound design, but then again, I did mention the shoestring budget they operated under. So instead, they put everything into the voice and music, reducing the priority of the sound effects. And that's pitiful. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes Deadly Premonition such a flawed masterpiece. I did promise you not to list just the positives, but the negatives as well. Now, you can pass your own judgment on the game, but bear in mind that nothing in this world is perfect. A perfect game director would have been able to handle the development process just fine, but, you know, I have no intention of calling anyone or anything I know as perfect. And through the grueling process of making this game, the developers at Access Games learned one thing: to never give up. Nor should you, dear viewer. You shouldn't give up on better things in this wonderful life. And this game is one such thing. It's an unforgettable experience through and through. I spent hours listening to its hauntingly charming soundtrack and dozens of hours trying to crack the case. It's worth it just for that. It's beautifully flawed in the way like you and me. You're flawed, I'm flawed, our parents are flawed, but we love them just the same. And I love this game just the same. I wasn't planning on getting all mushy on you, but talking about things that are important in our lives makes us appreciate them more with each time. And sure, if you want exceptional controls or groundbreaking graphics, you're out of luck. But if you're in the market for a game that's filled with love and passion from its developers, step right the fuck up. I believe that the greatest success that Deadly Premonition has as a game is the fact that you can see the love that was poured in the game by developers. It had a shoestring budget, it was almost cancelled 4 times, but it persevered, and it gives us something that we won't find anywhere else. To quote Destructoid, "There's absolutely nothing in this industry that can compare with how weird and wonderful the whole experience is." End quote. I love this game. And I can't say my coffee warned me about this ride, but it was worth it. 100%. Every polygon, every in-game minute, every music track, every coffee drop, every line. Detective Francis York Morgan is on the case, which means it's time to mix zombies, dreamy atmosphere, spotty voice acting, brilliant soundtrack, one-of-a-kind story, and movie trivia all together. Add a splash of love, and you get Deadly Premonition. If you play this game, you'll never forget it. That I can promise you. Thanks for watching.